Hi, I'm Jessika Castillo. I'm the small fellow in museum studies, and I spent my time this summer at the African American Museum of Iowa in Cedar Rapids. The African Museum of Iowa is in Cedar Rapids, but it was originally funded through a small group at the Zion Baptist Church in Cedar Rapids. They were interested in finding what the history and culture of African Americans is in Iowa, and they found quickly that their project was a lot more expansive than they could have ever imagined. So they eventually found a museum space, and there are 8 branches across all of Iowa. The center in Cedar Rapids is the leading force. At my internship, I had a couple of goals, and essentially I wanted to become acquainted with curatorial and archival best practices, and in that I was working under Lynn Cruz, who is the current curator of the African American Museum. And what I did essentially was work on about 3 big projects, maybe 4, and that was the Virgil Powell collection. I'll talk a little bit about Virgil Powell in a little bit. And I worked with the museum's oral histories. There are 2 oral histories, but I kind of count it as one project. And then I worked on revising outdated museum documents. So we have things called traveling trunks. Essentially, they are small containers of information that'll teach you specifically about one portion of African American history. So, in this, I'm going to start with the Virgil Powell collection. Virgil Powell was an African American police detective in Iowa. He kind of brought fingerprinting to Iowa in general, but not only was he kind of a leader in his field, but he had many other interests as well. So he was an amateur photographer, he was an inventor, he was a collector of stamps. Here you can see his fingerprinting game, which he developed himself, and he even went through the patents and the appropriate channels to have it made into something that could be marketed largely across the nation. So I went through any and everything you can imagine for Virgil. Essentially, I kind of went through his life, and I went through a lot of his photography that he did himself, which ranged from work-related things to family vacations, kind of still life of what is life in the garden. He owned a farm. Well, he owned some land in which he kept farm animals, and he had yearbooks that kind of covered his life, everything you can imagine. And then I went through the oral history collections, which were collected relatively recently, between 2003 and 2008 primarily, and those are chronicles of African Americans in Iowa telling their stories, kind of for the benefit of everyone else. Those are digital, so they're actually recorded. So what I ended up doing was looking at the raw files, so the DVDs that they were originally on, taking those from the DVDs, kind of changing their formatting and making them most easily accessible, not only in the museum for our own archive, but later to be published online. So instead of having to come to the museum and maybe reading a transcript or watching the video, you could now go on the website and see everything that we have to offer regarding those. I talked a little bit about traveling trunks. Those are kind of more educational tools. They're usually for middle school and elementary school to kind of learn about specific things. A lot of the time, ones that are out are kind of the George Washington Carver traveling trunk, or the Kwanzaa trunk is usually out in the holidays. But I revised kind of the old narrative that would go with those. And then I worked on a project called Old Tailor Presents, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And I worked at the summer camp my very last week of my internship, and that was when about elementary, maybe 6th grade, a little bit of middle school too, students would come and spend, a good week at the museum during the day. So that was interesting. Old Tailor Presents was, or is, that collection of busts. They're made of brass, and they're, solid through. They don't contain anything, which is kind of funny because Old Tailor was a whiskey company. Old Tailor doesn't exist anymore, but it was out of Kentucky, and Old Tailor decided to put out these busts of ingenious Americans, which is what their kind of campaign was called, of all African American inventors and scientists, just to kind of foster community in the African American community that they saw as being, hardy consumers. So if you bought specific magazines that were usually catering towards African Americans, you would see ads for the bus, and you would buy them for $5 a piece. They didn't come with any alcohol, they were just kind of there to look nice on your mantle. So when a Cedar Rapids elementary school teacher found them, she said, "That's brilliant, I want all of these," and we have those, which are from her collection. She never drank a day in her life, but she did use them to teach her students. So what I did is, I was told about these busts, and then I was told, make a display, and that involves everything from changing the old display, which you can see there's a little piece of plastic there, so you have to clean it with a brush, put museum wax, fix the hard plastics that keep everything safe and fine, and then organize this for best presentation, which is highly subjective, but my goal was to be as accessible as possible. This case is in the the parlor of the museum, so when you first come in, it's off to your side, and you don't necessarily go and look at it immediately straight on, so I wanted it to be able to be seen well and see all the busts clearly from just entering, and then as you move again to see directly in front of them, everything would still be legible. So I played a little bit with design and height because there are 7 busts and it's kind of a crowded case, and I found that height was what was going to work for me, but not necessarily that design. What you see is the finished product over there. There's a little tags that I wrote, which was kind of working on the writing skills of what works in a museum setting, especially for an audience that varies, which is something that I really benefited from. But then again, I wrote a nice, proper article detailing a little bit more of the history of what happened at Old Taylor and how we acquired them. If you want to read that, you can get it in the Isle of Griot. So that was kind of a fun portion, but a lot of the time I was working on the Virgil Powell collection, and it's because Virgil Powell lived a long life and he had tons of stuff that he did. So what you see here is the finished Virgil Powell collection. I finished all of my projects at the museum. Those kind of big containers, there were 5 of them, and as you can see, everything is organized in its nice little folder. All of those 5 containers are still full of materials, but those are all oversized materials. So there was more than that, and there were, I think, 13 boxes of other materials that can fit in proper archival storage boxes. Those are from Gaylord, and those are the gray boxes. And then finally, a kind of oddball of his collection were stamps. Stamps are not very friendly to archival practices. They're meant to be sticky, and to keep materials best preserved, it needs to be a certain temperature, and it's a strange kind of humidity in which if it's too dry, papers can crack. If it's too wet, they get weird and moldy, and that weird little center, which is perfect for most paper materials, is really strange for stamps. So that was his finished stamp collection, which I kind of had to think, all right, what are these going to be in the end, and how can we save them for the longest amount of time? So what I learned intellectually involved marketing techniques and audience sampling. Primarily that went in with the Old Taylor project. I learned how to write proper item tags for museums, and then articles. A lot of that was also the revision of the traveling trunks, and that kind of works in with how I worked with community schools and organizations. I had to tailor my writing to be most accessible, not only for the people who would be reading things like the griot, but for the people who would be receiving the trunks, teaching them, and then the audience at which those trunks were going to. The community school work and organizations was obviously relevant in my kind of summer school experience, summer camp, excuse me. Children are super excited to learn, which I loved, but sometimes their attention is a little bit lacking, and you'd be amazed at how many different ways you can incorporate learning and the kind of measures we took for African culture in their kind of day-to-day. We even made tag relevant. So I guess finally, intellectually, I learned how to present my findings and informations to various groups, and that kind of was implemented in my time at summer camp. Personally and professionally, I learned what it is to be in a work culture. I've never had kind of a white-collar office job. A lot of it's kind of in service work, so it was really interesting and fun to kind of be with other professionals and take a lunch hour and kind of learning how to navigate what it entails and what is like proper practice. And then I learned how to grow past my comfort levels to complete a job. Oftentimes in school, especially for a historical field that I'm interested in, you have a very set out basis and plan of what you traditionally do. And here at a museum, a lot of the time it's, okay, we need to fulfill these goals, we need to do it quickly, efficiently, so make it happen. There's never going to be a kind of guide to tell you what to do, and it was really valuable for me to have this experience to know how that works, kind of MacGyvering the field in something so specific to my interests. And that kind of worked in with how I had to rely upon myself to execute and forward plans. My academic and future impact is incredibly important to me. This internship was incredibly important to me because it focused my studies. I study history and classical studies, and archival practice is a little bit different, especially curatorial practice. They're not opposing ideas, but they more often coordinate than agree with each other most of the time. So I realized that I can still be a historian, I can still definitely be an archivist, even though they have different goals in mind. And it presented an opportunity for independent study and research. I used my time at the museum to further a later paper that I ended up writing this year. So that was really valuable to me. I had a lot of my legwork done, and I had a specific topic I was interested in at that point. And then it gave me, of course, first-hand experience with museum culture. Essentially, archives is something that's incredibly attractive to me as a future job. So I now know that if and when I go into applying for any other academic opportunities, grad school, I'll have a leg up on everybody else. And then finally, it fostered my self-confidence and sense of accomplishment in the field. I've now done, real work, and I feel prepared that, even if I'm not, fully immersed in whatever I kind of want to pursue at another museum, maybe later on, I know that I have the skills to kind of navigate that later. So I want to say thank you to my donors, Richard and Norma Small. My time at the museum wouldn't have been possible without their efforts, and then my site supervisor, Lynn Coos, who was amazing and always guided me through whenever I needed help, and then my faculty sponsor, Phil Lucas, for encouraging me to take this opportunity. Thank you.